finally got the notification we were dreading. We are dropping support for RethinkDB. The way that we use RethinkDB is really fundamentally relational. We have a concept essentially of like these foreign keys between records. We do effectively like a lot of joins and filtering on joins.
Has your opinion about how to build software changed with the rise of AI tools?
We mostly use Claude at my current company, and what's good for humans is good for Claude, or vice versa. What's good for Claude is good for humans. I kind of just decided that like, we'll just let Postgres lead the way.
What do you do when IBM kills your database? That's exactly what happened to Andy Munro and his 5-person team at LaborChart. They built their entire construction scheduling app on RethinkDB, a technology that had already been defunct for 2 years by the time Andy got there. They were running on the last hosting provider, which had been acquired by IBM. And finally, they got the email. IBM was dropping support. No migration path, no alternatives, just an end date. So Andy had to lead a complete database migration to Postgres while keeping the product running with zero downtime in the wake of an acquisition. What he built wasn't just a migration script, though. It was an entirely new way of thinking about data transformations that would later shape how he approaches building with AI. This is that story. Today on the show, I've got Andy Munro. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Glad to be here. Yeah, how's it going with you?
Things are great. It's hot here, so we are all experiencing a heat wave that's come far too early, but we're gonna make it through anyway.
Yeah. We were just talking before the recording started. My AC just went out like, I don't know, probably 2 hours ago, and it's like 90 degrees where I am. So if I sound sweaty in audio, that's why.
We're gonna get this done before you have to go downstairs and put ice packs over your back. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So today we wanted to talk about, we were chatting a little bit before the show, and you had said that you'd worked on a migration of Rethink to Postgres when you were at LaborChart, which required the whole thing. Before we get into that story, tell me a little bit about, like, set the stage for me on LaborChart. Like, what kind of work were you doing there, and what was the sort of journey of the company that led to that moment?
Yeah, so LaborChart was an interesting company. Say was because they were acquired a few years ago. I think it was like 2022, something like that. But yeah, LaborChart was based in Kansas City, and it was founded actually by, it was like a 3rd generation electrical contractor was our like founder CEO. His name's Ben Schultz.
Cool.
And it was really built to solve the like specific needs of like especially specialty contractors in like construction, but it generalized pretty well as well. And the whole premise of it is it's a labor scheduling software. So like the core workflow that you think of for a tool like LaborChart is like, so the like way that construction works like pre-LaborChart is you've got like the foreman on these job sites, and they might say like, I need like, 3 guys with X skill set for these dates. Find me someone. And then so they put that request in with the scheduler, and the scheduler is literally like some guy who's got some like bespoke whatever system, and he just calls everybody until he can like get the scheduling worked out. And like that's the way the whole thing works. It's scheduling is mostly like sort of listed out on a whiteboard somewhere. So like the people who actually are being scheduled like would physically go somewhere and look at a whiteboard, and that's how they know where to go. So LaborChart was basically like SaaSifying all of that. So now it's like the foreman or whatever can just like on like an app or on the web app can just they can like put in a request again with all the like parameters that they need for the person, and then a scheduler, or it could be multiple people now that it's like a shared system, like not like one guy's Excel spreadsheet or something. They can just go and they can assign people who are free to that particular project for those particular dates, and it like just works. And it automatically sends like texts too. So people get the automated text and can say, yes, I will be there, or no, I won't. And yeah, so helps make managing that kind of stuff a lot easier. So the like core concept of this system is like you have people, you have projects, you have an assignment, which is like a person to a project for some dates, and you have a request, which is like basically a pre-assignment. It's like before you have a person.
Hmm. Yeah, makes
And that's
sense.
like the core.
Yeah, that makes. I love this. I actually listened to a podcast from the CEO of Procore recently, and it
We
is.
were acquired by Procore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And it is fascinating because construction broadly and like is just a far more logistically complex business than even people who know a little bit about construction or trades or whatever think that it is. There's a lot of people like the founder of LaborChart, I imagine, who sit around and like they thought they were going to be out there like working with people and doing this job that they learned how to do, and then they end up in a scheduler role where they sit in a room and they like call people and push paper around, and it kind of sucks. And they're like, why is this really the job? And uh it has a lot to do with just like how efficient construction has gotten. um and it's amazing that it all works on whiteboards, or did until recently, I guess.
Yeah. And I would also say like an interesting part too is like, as I have seen it, there's like not very much like Venn diagram overlap between like tech people and like construction people.
Right.
And so you don't end up with like a lot of really great tech in support of construction, because the like shared like the people that have context on both of those things is like pretty small. And so yeah, I like continue actually to think that there is probably a lot of opportunity in software for construction, that is like basically untapped. But
Yeah, yeah, it
uh
makes a ton of sense. There's
yeah.
just yeah, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about the app itself. That's, you have what sounds like a fairly straightforward data model. You're matching people to assignments. How did you model that out? What was the tech stack when you got there?
Yeah, so the tech stack when I got there, which didn't change too much over the course of my time there. I was only there for, I think it was like, including pre and post acquisition, it was probably a little over 2 years, something like that. But it was Node.js backend and like single page application front end, actually using a tool no one uses anymore called Knockout. For those of you that are familiar, um, which actually worked pretty well. We didn't have like a huge amount of like, I don't know, like feature change velocity, but it kind of didn't really matter. We had really strong product market fit. And so mostly it was like iterative features that we shipped while we were there. But we did do a pretty major refactor of like the main API service. The code used to be all CoffeeScript when I started, and the new API was sort of like a gradual rewrite to TypeScript. Some of the endpoints were like basically straight rewritten, and then like any new features that we built that needed a new endpoint obviously went in this like new API. So we had like 3 Node.js backends, which were basically the legacy like API backend, and then there was like a public API sort of
Mm.
legacy backend, and then there was this like what we called core API, which was the new TypeScript thing that could serve both of those legacy purposes.
Oh, cool, interesting.
Yeah, so it was designed from the beginning to be able to support both internal and external like API use cases. Um,
Cool, that makes
but
sense.
yeah, and then our of course the main topic of this conversation, the primary database that we used was a database called RethinkDB, which is a like JSON document database. And I actually thought RethinkDB had a really great API. I thought they had some really great ideas, but they ultimately went defunct. My understanding is they like more or less got outcompeted by MongoDB.
Mhm.
Um, it feels like a sort of like uh, classic story of like I think RethinkDB maybe had a more interesting like theoretical foundation, like a more thoughtful start, but they weren't as good at distribution as Mongo was. Mongo was way better about actually getting people to use the software and figure out how to turn that into a business, from my perspective, than RethinkDB was. And I think that's why they ultimately went under. But ultimately, I thought that the API was actually really great to use in a lot of ways. It was very easy to like ship pretty quickly with it. Um, it had support for like, custom like secondary indexes and like not quite foreign keys, but like you could do effectively joins pretty easily with Rethink.
Mm-hmm.
Even though
Which
you
of
didn't
like,
actually have foreign key validations, um, it was still like relatively easy to make those things work.
which was a big complaint for the longest time about Mongo, is that you stuff all your data in there, and then all of a sudden you're pulling half of your data set into memory to do anything with it.
Right,
They
right,
added much of this over time because they had the luxury of doing so.
right, exactly. Um, but yeah, and one of the like cool things, one of the things that I thought was pretty nice about RethinkDB is it had this like you it didn't have a separate like sort of string based query language like you would have with like Postgres.
Mm-hmm.
The way that you interact with RethinkDB is they had um, basically these like query builders that you could write in like a couple different languages. Definitely JavaScript had support. I know there was like a Ruby syntax that was supported as well, and maybe also Python or Java. I can't quite remember, but I know Ruby had support and definitely JavaScript did because that's what we used. And you could just write in JavaScript directly like these sort of these like built queries. So you could have a bunch of if statements to add on like another like where clause or like things like that. And we used that pretty extensively in the code base, which came into play when we ultimately had to move, like trying to figure out something that could be as dynamic as what RethinkDB was as far as like actually doing the queries.
That's really interesting. I want to come back to that because I feel like interacting with something like a SQL database, like so many people fall back into an ORM or a query builder or something like that. Being able to just say like this is the native interaction with the language seems great, but also a terrible thing to give up when you actually have to go backwards to, well, not backwards, but you have to move to a technology that's not uh, borderline defunct.
Yeah, yeah, you get to that like I feel like I've heard people call it like a sort of impedance mismatch or
Yeah,
that kind of thing where it's like you're going between, SQL has its way it understands data, and then also your programming language of choice has its way that it understands data. And that mapping is not usually one to one, and you have to figure out how do you deal with that. Which RethinkDB, that wasn't an issue.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I've heard that story a lot for NoSQL databases. Like it makes sense. It's very easy. Go get me a thing. Here's the thing. Here's all the
Mm-hmm.
associated things with my thing. That's very straightforward. Mapping the full breadth of SQL into a otherwise, into something like Ruby or Node is not necessarily quite as straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so what was the timeline on RethinkDB? I should have gone and looked this up, but it was your impetus for moving was a moment in the RethinkDB ecosystem.
Yeah, so let's see if I can remember the name. So it was like already like the business I think had already shuttered by the time I'd started at LaborChart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was open source, like you could still use it, you could self-host it if you wanted to. But ultimately our impetus to leaving, this was post acquisition that we actually decided to do this, was we were using uh let's see, it was a company called Compose or compose.io, something like that, um, for a hosted version of RethinkDB. And they were like the main player in hosting RethinkDB if you wanted like a managed instance of it. Um, and at some point, they got bought by IBM. And eventually, we finally got the notification we were dreading, which is we are dropping support for RethinkDB. And at this point, there was really no one left that was looking to run managed instances of RethinkDB for us, and there was not an interest at the organizational level of self-hosting RethinkDB and just managing that forever. So yeah, the decision got made that will put in the effort and will migrate to Postgres. Procore uses Postgres for its main app as well, so it's they're like mostly a Rails monolith, or they were at the time, and so they had a lot of people who really understood Postgres, and so it was also desirable for them to have uh, us be using the same database that they mainly use and had all the expertise in. And obviously Postgres is Postgres. It's a great database. It's hard to go wrong. Yeah, I would advise anyone to, like, if you're just starting out on a project these days, you should just use Postgres until
Just use
you
Postgres.
like really need to not use Postgres for some reason, which is like increasingly a smaller and smaller subset of use cases can't get by with Postgres.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's great software. Tell me a little bit more about actually making this decision. Did you see, I mean, you knew like RethinkDB, the company, was acquired by Stripe in like 2016. So like been a minute.
Yeah.
Did you, it sounded like you saw this coming to a certain extent. Had you like pre-rolled that discussion about what you were going to do?
There was conversation about it for some time. I think even pre-acquisition, there was like, so the other co-founder of LaborChart, the CTO, who built a lot of the app in the first place, was named Hunter Browning. And Hunter and I, every once in a while, would just talk about, like, he's like looking at like other things we could move to. So we talked about things like, do we move to like Couchbase? Do we move to Mongo? Do we move to like AWS, like DynamoDB? Like, there's these others like document DBs out there. And I remember looking around at them a little bit, and I was like, the way that we use RethinkDB is really fundamentally relational. Like, we have a concept essentially of like these foreign keys between records, and like and we do effectively like a lot of joins and filtering on joins and all that kind of stuff. And looking around at these other document databases, is none of them had support for that kind of thing to the extent that RethinkDB did. As far as like the ergonomics, like, of course, you can do anything if you try hard enough, but like
It's a computer, just write more code.
Yeah, but really it was like, I remember talking to Hunter for the longest time, just saying like, we're going to end up moving to Postgres. Like, Postgres is really, it's like the right solution for the data that we have and the way that we use it. So that conversation happened for a while. And then obviously post acquisition, when that conversation started to come back up, there was more serious investigation that, I think mostly happened between Hunter and some of the like more senior technical people at Procore. And while I wasn't fully involved in all of those conversations, ultimately, yeah, Postgres ended up being picked, and I would still say is the right answer. Obviously, the migration eventually worked. Maybe spoiler alert, but
it did work.
Yeah. So
Procore continues to let everyone make everyone use Postgres, and
yes,
it was the right decision. So that's great. Tell me a little bit about you mentioned that because Procore used Postgres, and I'm sure there was some pressure to standardize technologies. I think there's this like base instinct of a lot of engineering orgs of like, we want to simplify our tech stack. Did they help you with the modeling or the thought process behind why it was best for LaborChart's data, or was that something that sort of all came from internal discussions?
Yeah, we did get some support from internal to Procore, but honestly, it was mostly just done by the team that we had,
Mm-hmm.
which was a pretty small engineering team. Like, we had, I don't know, on the neighborhood of like 5 engineers when we were acquired.
Oh, wild.
It was a really small team. Like, I was running the engineering org, and like, I don't know, I did not have like a lot of like professional software engineering experience at that point. Like, I don't know, like, I had some leadership experiences from like college orgs, and like I got software pretty well, but yeah, it was a small team. And but yeah, mostly we were allowed to pretty much run with it as long as it seemed like what we were doing was making sense.
Mhm.
I think someone would have raised the flag if it seemed like we were doing something that was like fundamentally not going to work, or like we were just wasting time or whatever. But no one ever really did that. Yeah. And the data modeling was mostly done by me, as far as like converting what we had in RethinkDB to Postgres, which one of the harder parts there is like, RethinkDB does not have schemas. It's a document database. So it's like, um, fortunately, in my history of adding TypeScript to a formerly untyped code base, I had written a lot of the TypeScript schemas for like most of our like tables.
Mhm.
So I knew basically the shape of everything, and I kind of like I knew sort of where the bodies were buried, where things had bad names, where there were like typos, and I actually used this like big database migration as an excuse to fix a lot of that stuff, which was like cool to be able to do. Nothing complicated, but just like, so I mentioned like those requests, these unfilled sort of like, I need a person of these skills for this project for these dates.
Mhm.
That was not the original name for that data model. It was originally called placeholders. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
in the product and like in our public API and everything, it was called requests, but in the database, it was actually still called placeholders. So you'd see like placeholder ID and like things like that. So this was an excuse to like fix all of those kinds of things. In like one or two cases, there were like, embedded like array of objects that we were able to convert to actually be like a proper like join table. Effectively, that what it was. That's what it was. But there were also a few cases too where it was just like, this is way easier to just move into a JSON B column, and so we did that too.
Yeah, I mean, Postgres support for JSON these days is great.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. Were there any one of my favorite bits of any like tech debt arcana? Were there any typos you got to fix where someone had spelled something wrong and you're like, now that's the name of the key, I guess?
yeah. So somewhere in the DB, I think there was a field called like recipient emails or something like that, or like recipients,
Mm-hmm.
and the I and the E were flipped. And that's the way it was added in the first place. That typo got into the public API.
Oh
Um,
no.
and so we actually like, we had to implement, once that was fixed, the public API actually had to continue supporting the typo in order to not break our customers. So I don't know if that ever got fixed. I would not be surprised if you
That's
still have
no, that's
to
part of the API. That lives
misspell
forever.
recipient. We might have added ability for you to like write to either of them. That would obviously be the most nice solution, but yeah, so like recipients was one that we got to fix. Yeah, because that was back in the days when it was like just Hunter, and like this isn't on Hunter. It's like,
Yeah.
if you're one developer just doing everything yourself, like you will make a typo and miss it eventually. Like that's why we have like PR reviews.
Right.
But
Pray for you that it only appears in like internal variable names. So that
yeah, yeah,
sometimes it ends
hopefully.
up in the database and lives forever.
But
That's
yeah,
funny.
so we did have at least that one case. I think that was the only like straight up typo. Um, Everything else was just like, there's like this changed names in the product over time, so we should actually just use the like the stable new name for it, rather than what it was named, years ago or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That stuff's inevitable. Like names drift and rot. And yeah,
Yeah,
we were already at turn, we already renamed one of the database objects. We have exactly one of these things. We're 6 months old.
yeah,
Oh well.
yeah.
We'll
Well,
fix
and
it
you
someday.
accumulate a ton of those in the beginnings too. Like you just inherently get the wrong, like you get things wrong the first time. My like rule of thumb is you really never get the like design of a new thing right until like you've done it the third time. Like the first time you literally just don't know what you're doing, and you learn by making mistakes. And the second time you like mostly know what you're doing and you get most of it right, but there's still just like one or two things where you're like, that is a problem. I wish I had done that differently. Third time, you can usually run with it for the long term,
I love your
without
caveat of usually.
majorly being upset about it.
I love it. Yeah, that feels right. Is that you definitely are not going to get it right the first two times. If you're good, third time.
Yeah, if you're good, if you're lucky, combination of everything. But yeah,
absolutely. So coming back to the modeling, that you had been in there, you kind of loaded all the context into your brain. You didn't know it, but that was that's what you were doing with the TypeScript migration. How did you just like sit down and like write out what the new schema was going to be based on that, or was there like an incremental approach you took, or something else?
yeah, I it was something that we mostly did by doing it. However, we did kind of get to cheat a little bit to start with. So ultimately, the library that I ended up picking for us to go for querying Postgres was a library called Kinects, KNEX. It's been around for a while. It's like sort of the like boring software version of a query builder for JavaScript and Postgres. And yeah, it had a concept of like migrations built into it, which we used. But one thing we got to do to start with is, before we were really actually doing real queries in production, we were doing these sort of like, we had this like fake, or not fake, it worked in development. And so as long as we weren't doing these migrations on a real production Postgres DB, we had the philosophy of just like, we'll just rewrite the migration files whenever we realized there's things we didn't do right. So that way it's not like we have these like, 300 migration files where it's just like we're like churning on the design or whatever. Like we had basically the like 0001 migration file that we did a lot of churning on, and you would just like nuke and rebuild your Postgres database whenever some recent PR had changed that, which everyone was used to doing. It was easy to do. Like we had a command for it. So, and that was most of how we did that. A lot of it was like me like manually mapping back and forth. Actually, one thing that we did do, I'm trying to remember how we did it now. I want to say I created some like, I think to get the TypeScript types back out of Postgres and making sure that they were right when we're like, type annotating our queries in Kinects, was I'd created some script at some point that for every type of like common field, it like maps that to a TypeScript type. And for more uncommon field types, so like for example, certain JSON Bs, there was like a hard-coded lookup that it would do to say like, oh, if it's this table and this field, it gets this type, like as a special case. And so we also had a script that I built to make it a little bit easier to work through some of these changes, and be able to get like, types to break in a good way in your code base. So it's like you would rebuild your Postgres DB from whatever is the latest migration. And then you would also, and it might have been in the same command that we had to run, it would like basically just extract the whole schema from Postgres using a query and then convert that into these like TypeScript files to annotate every table. So that way, even when we did make changes, you didn't get like caught out by like, oh, we changed this from like an int to a float because we didn't realize there's actually a case where it's a decimal or whatever. Not that it matters for TypeScript; it's always number, but like
yeah. But that's cool. So you sort of like started with like we're trying to get the modeling right. You're trying to get the schema right, but you're pushing that back up into the queries almost automatically because of the power of adding types.
Yeah, because uh, I mean, really, the philosophy that I had, and I still I have the philosophy that I think like this is a good way to build your software is like Postgres is harder to change than the rest of your code. And so
Yeah.
really it's like you really care about how does Postgres think about this data more than how the code thinks about it. Um, and so like, you don't want to be in a situation where it's like, your type annotations are becoming out of sync with Postgres. And it's like, how do you make sure, oh yeah, this is exactly it. The problem was like, am I are we building a model where a developer is going to have to remember to update these fields in two places every time? That sounds like a huge pain. Um,
Yeah.
and so we just decided, or again, we're a small team. I kind of just decided that like we'll just let Postgres lead the way, and um, we will write the migrations that we need to get Postgres in good shape, and then to actually update the type definitions. Yeah, we would just extract from Postgres and process it.
Interesting. That's super cool. I mean, it makes a ton of sense, right? That you were spending all of this time on getting the Postgres migration right. You're only going to do the migration, once, fingers crossed.
Right, right.
um,
Well, and
the,
we got
the
to
rest of
benefit
it
from
change.
it down the line too. Like if we added new fields, like they got types, and that was free. Unless you had a really like weird field, then you might have a couple manual things to do. But if you were doing like a UUID, you just got that it was a UUID, and that was done.
Yeah. Yeah. That's straightforward. That's cool. So how did that, all right. So you spent all your time thinking about the Postgres layer, auto-generated types for it. I love that approach. How did that like intersect with the queries? I'm particularly interested in like how did that intersect with the queries that you had this totally separate language for RethinkDB with the query builder. What were you? How did you like move over those incrementally as you churned, or how do you think about that?
Yeah. So there was a different pattern for reads versus writes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of my like proudest pieces of this migration was uh, coming up with these tools that we ended up calling PG writers. Um, so earlier on in my time at LaborChart, back when it was still LaborChart, uh, I had ended up building a tool for saving our different models called Save Manager. And what Save Manager's job was is it was like a shared way of like writing records to the DB and managing these like sort of what was previously like tricky use case where we had like basically an event system. We called them activities. And it used to be you just have to manually know what activity to save with whatever write you were doing. So like say like um, a person's name was changed or something, you want an activity for that. Used to be you'd have to just like know to also save that in that spot. And what Save Manager did was it created this layer where RethinkDB supported when you made a write, you could get the old and the new JSON back.
Mm-hmm.
And so almost all of our activities could be computed based off of the delta between the before and after JSON schema. So Save Manager would actually just do it for you. Um, if the delta at hand had, the right kind of change, you would just automatically log whatever activities and you did not have to think about it.
Cool.
So one of the cool things about all of our saves going through this save manager was uh, so like all of these writes, like we're just writing a JSON object, which is pretty straightforward. So one of the insights that I had at some point is there was someone else from the Procore side who was like, his job was to do like figure out how to do the database migrations, like migrating our old data into our new data. And like he clearly seemed to be struggling. I think he just didn't have as much context on how to work with that kind of code base. And I was working on like how do we do dual writes, where it's like if we write a request and rethink, we also write it to Postgres.
Yeah.
Um, and I ended up coming up with this tool called PG Writers that basically you could just take these JSON blobs that would have been a like row, so to speak, in Rethink, and it would just automatically do all of the appropriate writes in Postgres, which kind of sounds obvious
Oh, I
as an
love
idea in
it.
hindsight, but like we just built a PG writer for each table, and it could pretty deterministically like just always write the correct thing. And what that also meant is like now this like difficult migration script where it's like you're trying to figure out how to map each table into Postgres is like, wait, we can just use the PG writers, and you just go through and like that's it. So you guarantee that you have the same logic in your migration code as you do in your dual write code. So there won't ever be any divergences where it's like, oh, the migration script actually like misses this case that like dual writes account for, or vice versa. It all used the same code for writing to Postgres based off of a write to Rethink. Um,
That is super cool. I was gonna
yeah,
ask, so there's no like out of band thing here. We like wrote a separate script to like go get the rethink data and put it in Postgres. So you just ran it through the PG writers.
pretty much. So it was a separate script. But
Yeah,
yeah,
sure,
it like
fair.
heavily used these PG writers where it was like, effectively just like in an appropriate order, like for looping over all of the records in each table and just like writing them, which in practice like worked pretty well. Yeah, we never really had issues with the PG writers, and they were tested pretty well and everything too. But um, it ran fast enough on our production DB, and we were able to even do it where like there wasn't even downtime. We would just write like we could migrate all of the data just while the app was running, being sensitive not to overwhelm the RethinkDB instance because RethinkDB is great, but it does not perform like Postgres does. We could overwhelm it if we weren't careful. And yeah, we would just do that while the app is running, and then we could rely on the app also like doing dual writes at the same time, and we would generally just and we would check for like created at or like updated at timestamp deltas to make sure we didn't actually do an out of date write or something like that.
Yeah, that
Um,
makes sense.
but yeah, that worked great. So that was how we did writes. Is we just shimmed in these PG writers into Save Manager, and it just that was it. And then
That's
the
cool.
read queries were harder, which was it's why we ended up picking Kinects over like any of the other libraries that existed out there at the time.
Mhm.
For those who are unfamiliar with Kinects, Kinects is not an ORM, but it is more than just a like SQL client, like
Mhm.
wrapper to the DB. It is specifically it's like a query builder, which was important because RethinkDB's native syntax was also like fundamentally a query builder syntax, and so we needed something that was going to be similar to that if we were going to have high odds of getting the same um, read queries from A to B and being able to work with our code where it was like we had a lot of situations where it was like, maybe you're on a list page and there's like a bunch of filters that you could choose to add or not add. And we had a lot of dynamicism in our code for like constructing those queries based off of whatever filters you passed.
Yeah.
So, we didn't want to do like string concats or anything like that to do that. But also like ORMs like didn't really feel like the right answer either. That felt like also a refactor from the rethink code. Um,
Yeah, that
so we ended
you
up with
had a
Kinects
query
and
builder already. Like,
right, exactly.
find a query builder.
Yeah. And in hindsight, I had no regrets about picking Kinects. I think it was absolutely the closest thing that we could have found to what RethinkDB had. And I still think, even though like Kinects is not I would say a a querying tool that gets very much attention in the JavaScript community. It's not
Mhm.
very sexy, but it was very stable for us, and I had good experiences with it.
That's cool. So if you had a magic wand, would you have still chosen Kinects? Like, I guess I'm trying to get at, it made the migration easy, but then did it put you in a good spot going forward?
I feel like it did. I mean, so fundamentally, like there were definitely still use cases where we had more complicated queries than the Kinects query builder syntax could do really well.
Mhm.
Particularly, like we had a couple of use cases where, um, I mentioned we still had some JSON B columns that we had to bring over just for pragmatic purposes, and there were a couple of cases where we had to like filter off of content in there. And Kinects is still fairly generic, like it's not uh, only for Postgres, and so it's missing features for things like JSON B selectors and things like that. So there were some cases where we had to drop into um, more like raw querying, um, but it was fine. It like you could do it, and the code was like a little bit scary looking, but you could understand it if you had a good understanding of Kinects. And for the most part, like easy things were still easy. And so, yeah, I would say there was no situation that I was like, I ever really was concerned with it. And it's as a query builder, its scope was limited enough that you didn't run into cases where it was like, oh, this particular situation, if you use Kinects for it, it actually like produces this like really poor query that has terrible performance. Like you're really working very close to the like raw um, whatever the sequel is going to be with Kinects, and that was uh, worked well for us. And I also didn't feel like it was like too low level to like onboard other people to it. Like it was still a fairly straightforward syntax, especially again for anyone that understands SQL. I think the ramp to learning Kinects was not that bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And at that point, like this app runs on top of a SQL database. It's not unreasonable to ask your developers to learn SQL. That's just,
Right.
you know, to your point of like the data is fundamentally modeled in SQL. It's going to be hard to understand what you should do if you don't understand how the data is modeled and how to interact with the data as it exists on disk.
Right. Yeah, and of course with Kinects being a like a SQL query builder, uh, it uses SQL terminology for everywhere it could in its API. So it was like you could just guess what it was going to produce and you'd be right almost all the time.
That's cool. I love it. See, SQL Alchemy's non-ORM mode, like the query builder there, has
mm-hmm.
always like I've loved it because it does that, right? You're like, I want to select this thing. I want to join on this thing. And so like I know what SQL this is going to produce, and
Yeah,
that's very straightforward.
yeah, um, yeah. Honestly, like the experience made me a big fan of query builders in general. Uh, like at my current job, we're a like Django based shop, and I I want to love Django, but I have to say I'm like I live in the hometown of Django right now,
Oh, I didn't
Lawrence,
realize that.
Kansas. Yeah,
Ah, that's awesome.
yeah, invented for the local newspaper, which is hilarious. Like a town of like college town of like not quite 100,000 people or something like that. But anyways, I want to love Django, but I joke that I'm Django's biggest hater because its ORM is like I think it's really great for like an old style Python, like pre type annotations and like all that kind of stuff. Like it is super usable, and for the like straightforward use cases that Django was really built to serve well, I think it's like yeah, it's still great for that. But we're becoming an increasingly sophisticated company, and uh, I find myself disagreeing with the way the ORM works, and it's an unfortunate emotional situation to find yourself in.
Yeah. Well, it's time to move to a query builder, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, cool. I want to come back and talk a little bit about what you're doing now and sort of what you think of in the future. But I guess to put a to put a pin in this story, so you got your out of band rights, you got your dual rights. Did you, as you figured out how to roll out the reads, how did you interleave that with the changes to the rights as well? Because you mentioned that was the more complicated part.
Yeah. So the way that we sequenced everything was we kind of mostly stabilized um, the um, the database schema before we like really started actually writing data in production.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we also sequenced like the tables that we cared about based off of the relationship mapping. So we didn't really have like circular relations between models, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
So we mostly said that like we started with believe it was companies was our like sort of like core accounts model, um, for like multi-tenant system. And so that one was the one that goes first because it doesn't really point at anything and everything else points at it. So
Mm-hmm.
um, when we moved to Postgres, obviously we wanted those foreign key relationships to be enforced there. So that means for that to work, you need the table that's being pointed to already be there. So we sequence like that. And once we'd mostly stabilized the schema, except for maybe some of those like very like you're going to do them last kind of tables,
Mm-hmm.
we started doing the dual writes. And once we had the dual writes like running for a bit, we'd done the migrations, we did some sort of validation checks, make sure that everything looked good. And then we would go through and we used like feature flags for everything. And so we'd feature flag for like one whole table. Again, maybe I'll use the company's table as an example. We'd have a feature flag for like, if we should be reading from the company's table or the rethink table. And so once we got to the point where one endpoint was like only reading from tables that had support for Postgres, like we felt the data was good, we validated and everything, we would flip a flag over. And now instead of reading from the rethink table, everything would read from Postgres for that one endpoint. And because we always wrote to both tables every time we did a write, we could safely assume that all of those tables were directly in sync with each other. And so we would assume it would not matter if you were reading from one or reading from the other.
Mm-hmm.
So we would just flip it over. And that also worked really well. Like I remember those first few tables where we like turned on writes for it, like, okay, like now's the big moment. Like,
Yeah.
are like customers about to crash or what's going to happen? And yeah, pretty much every time we like had nothing. Nothing came
That's
through on
awesome.
Sentry, like radio silence, which is like, you know, exactly what you want to have happen in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to hear a peep.
Yeah. Which also one thing we did, I forgot, there was one of the ways that we did validation that I didn't mention was prior to actually returning the Postgres data, we we actually had a stage where it was like it would read from both databases and sort of convert both of them to the like JSON that the JavaScript would actually operate on. And if there was a difference, we'd like log an error. And so
Cool.
we got to see ahead of time anywhere where we were making any mistakes in production before we actually started returning anything. Um, and so like we had uh, a very high like safety model for making sure that this worked. And in practice, it worked really well.
Yeah. Yeah, you knew ahead of time. Like you had done the comparison. You'd been dual reading, but just dumping the logs out.
Right.
So yeah, you can't make it much lower risk than that, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's cool. That's very cool. And now they run Postgres.
Yeah. Now they run Postgres. Yeah, I actually ended up uh, leaving from Procore before it was all finished, but I've kept up with former coworkers, and they got it done after I left, which is also like, I was a really big driver for like the design of the project and a lot of the implementation because I had just like I don't know, I really wanted to see it happen. I wanted it to work. I was like excited and energized by the project in general. And so you always hope that like if you actually leave, like will people really be able to like take up the mantle without me to like provide context and guidance and things like that. And fortunately, it all worked out. They did eventually get through it, which is great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things of these like larger projects where it seems like you have a plan and a way to go forward, but actually it's all on your shoulders. And if you're not there, it doesn't get done. And it feels bad to leave a project
Yeah.
in that state.
Right.
So it's cool that you imbued it with enough momentum that it actually finished after you left.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right, we're coming up on time, so I just wanted to ask a couple of quicker questions.
Go for it.
So you mentioned earlier that your view of building software is like start with what's durable, start at the database, and kind of build your way out from there. Has your opinion about how to build software changed with the rise of AI tools?
Great question. That aspect, I would still lean the same way. And maybe with AI tools in general, I kind of have this philosophy of like, we mostly use Claude at my current company, and I've started saying people like, what's good for humans is good for Claude, or vice versa. What's good for Claude is good for humans. So I think most of the time, like when I think about AI tools, I really like think about like as a human, like what would be the best context to give, and I think that ends up being the same thing that's good for these AI tools most of the time. And so I'd say like, yeah, like what do AI tools really need to be able to succeed is like they need to know what the database is. They need to know how it's structured and be able to understand whatever form of like conceptualizing that you have. So like in our case, it's like Django models, but obviously different in other cases.
Cool. Yeah, I think that that resonates. That makes a ton of sense. There's I've talked with a bunch of people where it's almost like the calculus of what you should do for both the humans and the machines has changed, because doing it just for the humans in some cases didn't feel worthwhile. But the machines are kind of dumb and they're kind of bullheaded and they're very productive.
Right.
So maybe you need to do it for the machines now as
Yeah.
well, and the humans still get benefit from it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah.
But I love that. What's good for the humans, good for the machine, and vice versa.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true. What was the weirdest bug you hit through this migration?
The weirdest bug. Good question. In hindsight, I don't think we really had that many bugs. We were really, really on the like safety side of it, like trying hard not to have them. Yeah, I think a lot of the bugs would have just been earlier on where it was like before we had the PG writers in place, and it was like migrations and dual writes like could get out of sync from each other. And then it's like, oh, like, why isn't this working quite right? And it's like, oh, like you assumed that and I assumed this. And so like this table is in a sort of incorrect state between the two.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Not super exciting bug stories, I guess.
That's the best.
Which, yeah, you want to be able to say that.
And last one, what can folks do to help you out, and where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, great question. I am working on getting my like blog back up and running. I forget what exact sub URL I'll put it on. I'll probably make everything go to the right place. But my website is andymonroe.dev. I have a Twitter, but I don't post that much on it. But that's, yeah, andymonroe.dev is probably the best place to find me right now. I am technically on LinkedIn, but your messages probably won't get to me. You can also just email me at mail@me.andymonroe.dev. That will also work.
We'll put links in the description.
Sweet.
Cool.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, TR.
This has been great. Thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.